From fabulous Las Vegas, Nevada, this is Pod Therapy. Real people, real problems, and real therapists. If you have any questions you'd like to ask or advice you'd like to give, come on over to podtherapy.net and join the conversation. Jim learned his Spanish from SpongeBob. This and other interesting facts on today's episode of Pod Therapy.
SpongeBob.
And now, broadcasting from Level 9 Studios, that guy is Dr. Jim Jobin. I'm Nick Tangeman. It's time for some Pod Therapy.
I can't believe you didn't know that I've taught Spanish. I thought we've talked about this.
Nothing about you screams, I know Spanish.
I feel like I'm essentially a mystery to you. I actually yelled at you about this once because I said something to you and you're like, wait, you did? And I was like, yeah, Nick, I did. That was a big part of my life. And I know a lot about you and you don't know anything about me. So shame on you. You're a bad friend. I was a high school Spanish teacher.
I'm sorry, I wasn't listening. What?
Ah, you bastard. You bastard. So for the listeners, since he teased it, ¿Quién vive en una piña debajo el mar? So I would ask that as soon as the first day of Spanish class started, I would yell that out. And then whichever kid raised his hand was like, SpongeBob. I was like, I gotcha. Like I knew, I got to identify all the kids that can speak it natively so I could get them out of there.
You know all you need to know. Get out of here.
Get out of here. A+.
Get to chemistry.
Yeah, go kick rocks. So that was my trap. I'd yell that out and like this one enthusiastic kid would be like, oh, SpongeBob. I'm like, ha-ha. I gotcha, punk. Yes. So it's going to be a very dynamic episode, Nick. We got a lot to talk about.
We do.
But first, a huge announcement.
Oh, yes. So for our fans and listeners out there, we are going to be doing a live show in October.
Yes.
We have been invited to do Scoop Fest.
Scoop Fest!
Yes. This is really exciting.
Salt pork.
So we have a bunch of our listeners are also Scoops, which are listeners of Ice Cream Social. We have talked about this on the podcast a couple of times.
And we were on their show not too long ago.
We were.
Great show. It's called Insepsis. Look it up.
Episode number, do you remember?
Oh, gosh. I just know it's
something
Insepsis.
or other.
Yeah. Go through their catalog. It's called Ice Cream Social. And look through their catalog for Insepsis, and you'll hear us on there, and that's when they announce that they're inviting us. But apparently this is like the Woodstock of podcasts.
It is. It's
amazing.
It's
here in Las Vegas. And so people from all over the country...
all over the world.
All over the world fly in to fabulous Las Vegas. They have a hell of a time. There is live broadcast by some great top-notch performers and podcasters, and also us. And so we'll be slumming it up.
We somehow were able to weasel our way into that.
Yeah. Somehow they took pity on us. But special thanks to Matt and to Paul. Super gracious of you guys, and we are so excited to be with you. And so, guys, if you're our listeners, whether you are also listeners of Ice Cream Social or not, you've got to come to this. You could meet us live and join our live session where we're going to do some group podcast therapy, some group pod therapy, and lots of fun stuff. But Nick, how can they book tickets to this thing?
You can go to heyscoops.com.
Heyscoops.com.
Yep, which is the official website of Matt and Mattingly's Ice Cream Social.
Yeah.
And if you go on there, then they've got tickets available. I want to say it is, I'm looking it up right now because I don't want to misquote. Scoop Fest is October, I want to say 10th, 11th, and 12th. Waiting for it. 12th, 13th, and 14th.
You were close. 12, 13, and 14. Go to heyscoops.com and you can book tickets to this thing. It is going to be a lot of fun, live podcasting done by some top-notch groups. And I think sometimes even Penn and Teller are known to show up, or at least Penn is.
Penn Sunday School, they haven't confirmed that.
Okay.
Penn was there, I think, the last 2 years.
I think he was at the last one, yeah. So who knows? You know, it could be some big wigs, but also we'll be there. It'll be a lot of fun. And on Twitter just now, one of the Scoops and one of our Twitter followers, his name's @SmittyScoop. We love you, dude. He said, hey, Pod Therapy guys, I'll be in town for Scoop Fest. Any chance that you will be free to join me for sushi at Naked Fish? I might even be able to convince some other Scoops to go. So Nick and I saw this on the drive here, and we said, hell yeah, we're doing that. In fact, we're going to launch a special get-together during Scoop Fest for anybody that wants to come, and we're calling it...
Well, we should talk about that.
We should discuss.
Because we don't want to do anything while other events are going on at Scoop Fest.
Yes. We shall do something with approval from the designated Scoop Fest people.
There's nothing else going on. So.
Yeah. So we're going to downgrade this event down to, we'll see what happens.
We'll see.
But the proposal on the table is sushi, sake, and psychology. And that's what I'm all about. So I think some sake psychology, Nick, with some sushi after, that should be a good deal. So if you want to join us for some sake, sushi, and psychology, if you want to come be a part of the live podcast, go to heyscoops.com.
Yes.
And show up here in fabulous Las Vegas, have a hell of a time, and we'll get to know you in person. It'll be a lot of fun.
Definitely, yeah. This will be a blast. We're really excited to be a part of it. Honored to even be asked.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
really
And
cool.
and hopefully we can get to this thing before Paul and Matt realize we have no clue what we're doing and that this is all a sham.
I know. We only have to fake it for
a couple months.
Yeah,
we're
a few
almost
more
there.
months.
Yeah, Nick and I have a calendar in the office. We just go up there every day and cross another day off, and we're like, okay, all right, another day out. They haven't figured us out yet.
So if you want to actually be present when this podcast jumps the shark, it's going to happen in late October.
Come on down for probably the last podcast of Pod Therapy before all of our more experienced mentor podcasts realize what a sham we are.
Yeah.
But lots to talk about, Nick. Lots to talk about. And so, in the beginning of the show, we tend to talk about new research, new studies, things that might affect real-world people. And recently, a huge study came out from the FBI.
Right. So the FBI released a study in which describes pre-attack behaviors of active shooters.
Yeah, so these are the folks that do the mass shootings that you hear about all over the news. As you know, we're from fabulous Las Vegas, and we are sadly the record holder right now. October 1 of last year, 2017, a man came and he shot at a outdoor music festival called Route 66.
Route 91.
Route 91. Route 66 is the actual route. And he shot from the window of the Mandalay Bay, and he killed just a tremendous amount of people. It was horrific. Nick and I, as therapists here in Las Vegas, were actually called in as second responders to this tragedy. And so there was a team of therapists that were called in to be crisis counselors, to de-escalate people, to try to deal with the trauma. And the way we tend to phrase it, if you're unaware of what that looks like, is first responders stop the bleeding, second responders restore sanity. And so for Nick and I, that was an extremely emotional experience, not just because we're locals, not just because we had friends who were there, but because we were part of the team that actually showed up and looked into the eyes of people who were made to feel like their lives were coming to an end that night and try to work with them through it. And that's something I know I'll never forget.
Absolutely not. I mean, it was terrible. It was not anything that was enjoyable by any means.
It shook us up.
Absolutely. Yeah, still today. It's kind of hard to talk about it.
And so when the FBI releases this report, I mean, it's stunning because it teaches us so much about the profile of the person who does this kind of thing.
Right. And so that's kind of why we wanted to bring this up, is to really kind of look at what were the findings. Because when a tragedy like this occurs, there's so many questions because we want to know and we want to understand everything that was going on, what caused this, how can we use this information to prevent future shootings, and what can we learn? So we found some really interesting stuff. So getting into a few of the takeaways that we got from this, the first one, demographics were useless in a way.
In some ways, Nick, the study sort of debunked some myths, at least in my mind. I sort of had this mentality of what I think an active shooter in America is and looks like. And what this study did is it sort of took it apart piece by piece. And I know for me, a lot of my stereotypes and thoughts and conclusions were sort of shattered. Mm-hmm. And what you just said about demographics was sort of one of the big ones for me. And then you can tell us about the next one. But for me, a big one was the demographics. And so what it showed was this pie graph of what kind of person does this. Now, overwhelmingly, they're male. Okay, so we all know that. But as far as nationality, culture, their race, their education level, their average income, whether or not they've been convicted of a crime, all of these demographic areas were identical to the American map. Mm-hmm. I mean, I thought they were all white men. I thought they were all in their, late 50s or something like that, or they were like a teenager. And it wasn't like that. Ages are spread all around, with the average age being in the 30s. White people were like 60% of it, and like 12% Asian, 16% African American. It looks just like a pie graph of America, with the only conspicuous difference being in the Hispanic culture. While there are lots of Hispanics in the American population, they were not among this study. But it really did debunk the myth for me that, a shooter looks exactly one way, but really it looks like anybody in America.
Right. So you can't really take any demographic information and be able to predict anything from that.
No.
Right.
Yeah, you can't spot one walking down the street or size them up by their Facebook profile. That's not really possible.
Right. Another thing that was kind of surprising to me, looking at isolation factors, I always kind of in my head kind of pictured the individuals that do this as being kind of to themselves, kind of the lone wolf that are just they don't associate
in a cave,
with other
in
people.
some dark room, polishing a gun. You know?
And that's not actually the case at all. Active shooters in the study were not completely isolated and had at least some social connections with other people. The majority did live with somebody at the time.
Yeah.
68%. Most had significant in-person social interactions with at least one person in the year before the attack.
Yeah. And, that actually is going to carry to, and I'll actually go out of order here, but another myth that I thought was that there's no warning signs. I thought that this stuff just happens and nobody saw it coming. But what you just said, they don't tend to be isolated. They tend to be actually pretty socially connected. And then the second, with that, another big myth that was sort of busted was this no warning signs thing. And what the study actually showed is actually most had behaviors that were noticed by other people. And those people even usually acted on that. Seeing those behaviors, they did something. But Nick, one of the things you were explaining to me from that part of the study was that, yes, people noticed it, but what they did was sort of insufficient.
Right. So I want to say it was, I'm looking for my notes right here, but for the most part,
I know that it was like the majority of people, the way they acted was they tended to talk to the person, right?
Yeah. So the most common response. So when somebody was able to identify some concerning behaviors, and they go into detail defining what concerning behaviors are, but when individuals noticed concerning behaviors in these shooters,
before the shooting,
the most common response was to communicate directly to the active shooter, which was 83%, or do nothing, which was 54%. So in many of the instances, the concern stayed between the person and the shooter.
They never got out to law enforcement. Else. They don't call a therapist. They don't try to do any outside third-party thing. Either they talk to the person, which is a good first step, or they just keep it to themselves. And so that was interesting as a myth debunked for me, Nick, because I thought nobody sees this person's isolated. But no, the study says no, they're not. In fact, people notice it. They just don't do much with it.
And they even, in the study, they even kind of talk to, or they hypothesize why that may be. Mm-hmm. And because they're not necessarily just isolated and they have a relationship with these individuals, that was one of the concerns that they found, was that it's possible that because of loyalty or disbelief that they would actually do it, or fear of the consequences, they don't report it.
Right. And another thing, too, that was another myth that sort of popped out of this was I always thought this is spontaneous. I thought a person goes to sleep on Tuesday and wakes up on Wednesday, pours a cup of coffee, and then just something happens, and they go, you know what, let's do it. I'm going to go grab this out of my car or in my closet, and I'm just going to go to the nearest place and start hurting people. But no, the study actually taught us that the shooters tend to plan and prepare, and it's a lot more than you would think. Like, the majority of the shooters tended to be planning this out for something like 2 months, 1 to 2 months before they actually behave, and they might prepare for, as long as a day if they're getting their equipment together and going to their site, or even weeks in advance. They could be preparing for it. I know the Las Vegas shooter prepared for this. He ammoed up. He got all of his weapons. He carefully staked out the zone he wanted to shoot in, and then he checked in to strategically 2 different rooms to prepare himself to be able to do this. So I always thought it was spontaneous and just sort of it happens in the dark, but no, the study said that's not the case.
Right, and the FBI also noted that they identified the difference between planning and preparation.
Right.
So planning being a lot of the thoughts of what they're going to do, how they're going to do it, and then the preparation being more like on site, like scouting out the area. And what they found was that there's a big difference between those two. There was a lot of planning, not a whole lot of preparation as far as scouting out the area, but then they identified that the reason why, or the most likely reason why, is because it was an area that the person was already familiar with.
Right.
So a great majority of the active shooting situations happened at the person's place of work or their school or something that they had daily contact with.
Which is interesting because when we think of something comparable like terrorism, you think of person who is not part of that community arriving in that community to hurt that community. But active shooters are actually the opposite. They tend to be from that region. You know, the Las Vegas shooter was from a town nearby called Mesquite. And the San Bernardino shooter was from San Bernardino. The Newtown shooter was from Newtown. And so, you know, the Orlando shooter was from Orlando. So Boston Marathon, you know, the same thing. They were in that area. So it's interesting that this is something where they plan and prep by knowing the area pretty well.
Yeah, and you mentioned terrorism. And so one of the things that the study looked at as well was primary grievances. So what was their motive that at least that the FBI was able to determine.
Right.
And by watching the news, you kind of get this idea that a big part of this is political or ideological based. And that was one of the big takeaways from this that I learned is that that's actually a very, very small percentage, actually 7%. Had some kind of grievance that was based in ideology or extremism.
Right, because you sort of imagine that there's going to be a manifesto and it's going to be like, you know, I Heil Hitler, you know, or something crazy like that. But the study not only said that's extremely rare, but it said, and this is another thing, either in my mind, the stereotype I had was either A, they have a manifesto, or B, they're completely unprovoked, right? I thought it was spontaneous. I thought it just happened like in the night. They saw a crazy commercial and they just went and did this. But really what the study says is that as many as 79% of them had some kind of primary grievance. And I actually wanted to read this, Nick. I highlighted this in the study because this was a line that I thought was really well worded. And so what the FBI did is they sort of explain what is meant by the word grievance. And the way this was phrased I thought was so indicative. A grievance is defined for the study as the cause of the active shooter's distress or resentment, a perception, not necessarily based in reality, of having been wronged or treated unfairly or inappropriately. More than a typical feeling of resentment or passing anger, a grievance often results in a grossly distorted preoccupation with a sense of injustice, like an injury that fails to heal. These thoughts can saturate a person's thinking and foster a pervasive sense of imbalance between self-image and the real or perceived humiliation.
Which ties in very closely to road rage.
Yes.
Road rage is a lot of the same thing, where it's this idea of this perceived injustice. I was wronged, and this lack of communication between me and the driver of this other car. I automatically assume intent, and there's this sense of I can't do anything about it. This person's going to get away with it, and there's nothing I can do.
Yeah, it's like a powerlessness, and that actually went to the final big debunked myth. I always thought the targets were random. It just looks like there's so much carnage. How could it possibly be premeditated? How could you have had a person in mind when you showed up to that place? But actually, the study said that like 64% of those who end up getting injured, they had a target in mind. The shooter, 64% of the time, had intended to at least hit this type of person, or this is where they wanted to hit. They don't like this people that work at this company, or people that are, in fact, children and are at this school, or people that are at that nightclub that fit a certain type. They are trying to hurt that group for a perceived grievance that they have against that group. And I found that fascinating.
Yeah. Now that still does leave 1/3 of them that
they don't know.
Yeah. Right? That would appear completely random.
So another thing that came out of the study that I really want to circle into, the FBI identified – now, again, it was hard to identify huge predictors, right, because they were saying, hey, demographically, these folks don't look different than the average American. But one thing the FBI zoomed into was this idea of stressors. So they said there are these stressors that we all encounter in life, and that's fine, and we learn to cope with our stress and our life conditions. But what was common among the shooters – they tended to have on average about 3.6 significant life stressors. And all of these things would be happening at once. And it would cause this sort of overload where the person would sort of snap and then excise their grievance at a target and then go on the shooting rampage. So they actually published, the FBI published this list of the stressors. And, what I want to do, Nick, is I want you and I to sort of unpack each of these in order, starting with the one that was least common, all the way up to the one that was most common, and then we can sort of unpack that. So starting at the bottom of this list, death of a friend or relative was noticed in about 6%. 6% of the shooters had that as a stressor.
Right. Civil problems identified as 10%.
Yeah, criminal problems. And this is another thing. We think, oh, they're all criminals. Well, no, only 11% of them we were able to identify, the FBI was able to identify that only 11% of them had a criminal problem as a stressor in their life, in the sense that they're entangled in the legal system. So 11% of them had that, though.
Sexual frustration or sexual stress. It was identified as 13%.
Which is interesting because you don't always think about that. But there's that incel movement, the involuntarily celibate, who say that they can't, get into a relationship. So that's something to think about. Another stressor next on the list was conflict. Conflict with family members specifically was noticed 16% of the time.
And then conflict with parents 18% of the time. They separated parents from other family members.
21% of the time, the person was having a life stressor of encountering some kind of physical injury, which was somehow causing them some kind of pain.
Conflict at school at 22%.
Which is fascinating because other kinds of conflict, like with having a caregiving responsibility, something that is sort of like a miscellaneous, uncategorized life stressor, they noticed that about 22% of the time.
Same as abuse for illicit drugs or alcohol is 22%.
And it's easy to think that's not an issue, but we're talking almost 1/5 or over 1/5 of them had some kind of abusive substances. Marital problems were noticed in the shooter 27% of the time.
And conflicts with friends or peers 29% of the time.
35% of the time they would have some kind of job-related stressor where they're losing their job, they're in fear of losing their job, or they've just lost their job, or they're just having conflict.
And 49%, nearly half, were financial strain.
Yeah, and that's a huge stressor too, because we think about economics and we fail to understand that economics affects all of this. But here was the king, okay? The number one biggest stressor. 62% of the time, the FBI found that the shooter had a significant life stressor inside of the issue of mental health. Now, obviously, you probably saw that coming because this is a pod therapy show. We're going to talk about that. But what we need to understand is, what does the FBI mean by that? So the FBI says, listen, of that category of people, right, only 25% of that 62% had a diagnosed mental illness, had a label of some kind of actual diagnosis. But what they mean is they saw in those people signs of depression, anxiety, or paranoia. And so that large number of folks, 62% of them, had exhibited symptoms of depression, paranoia, or anxiety. And of those, only 25% had a diagnosis. Now, that's gigantic, and we need to reflect on that. But for me, Nick, another thing that this addressed is what I call the Joker hypothesis. Because based on Batman and Arkham Asylum and all this stuff, we think that the person who's going to do mass crime is quote-unquote insane or quote-unquote crazy, right? They're the Joker. They have no reason. Some men just want to watch the world burn. But what this teaches us is that these people didn't have psychosis. They didn't have schizophrenia. They weren't unconnected to reality on its terms. They had a grievance, and they had a lot of life stressors, and then they had a low mental immune system because they were experiencing depression, paranoia, or anxiety.
Right. What we would refer to as resiliency. Also one of the big factors leading to the determination of who is more likely to experience post-traumatic stress disorder or get diagnosed with that. Not only is it the exposure to a traumatic event, but it's also the resiliency that the individual has.
Yeah, and 50% of these people had some kind of suicidal ideation. So we can see that they've become self-destructive, they are unhealthy, they're depressed, they're anxious, they're paranoid, they are low resiliency, and then these other life stressors happen. They develop a grievance, some kind of unrealistic resentment of another person or entity, and then they feel like they need to exact justice.
So to kind of summarize, I think what you're saying is it's not this idea of somebody with schizophrenia who goes out and shoots.
Right. It's not the Joker hypothesis.
Right. It's somebody with most likely some other form of mental illness, depression, anxiety, mixed with or in addition to multiple stressors going on.
Yes.
The average was 3.6 stressors per shooter, not just one thing.
Yeah, and we all go through this stuff, but we have coping skills, we have resiliency, or we go see a therapist. Mm-hmm. These are people where they didn't have any of those things and they never did those things. And then they plot and they plan, and that's their relief. Their relief from the pain is to imagine exacting some kind of violent justice. That's the fantasy they begin entertaining, and eventually they act that out. So guys, this is grim data, but it's valuable data. It's something I want other people to hear. I want you to share this podcast because it's important that we all begin to know what are the signs and symptoms. And if you know somebody in your life who has depression, who has anxiety, who seems paranoid, who's going through a significant amount of life distress, guys, if you notice these warning signs, you shouldn't think in your head they're the next shooter, right? That's like as rare as a lightning strike.
Right.
But the good news is that whether they're the next shooter or whether they're just your coworker, colleague, or friend, the answer that you should have is the same. Hey, have you thought about seeing a therapist? Hey, here's a list of therapists in our area. Hey, we both work at the same place. Did you know that there's a list of therapists that take our insurance? Mm-hmm. Buddy, I'd really like to see you go check in with somebody. I worry about you. You don't seem like you're very healthy right now. No matter what, that is actually the right way to address that.
Mm-hmm. All right, we're going to go ahead and take a break. When we come back, we will discuss online therapy. You're listening to Pod Therapy.
We're back. You're listening to Pod Therapy, and it's time to dive into our listener mail. All right, the first question is, what are your thoughts on internet therapy? Hi, guys. First, I wanted to say I love the podcast.
Hi, Mom.
Yeah, we love you too. I heard you on Ice Cream Social. Oh, cool.
What do you know?
It's a scoop. Right on. Come to Scoop Fest. I heard you on Ice Cream Social, and I've binged all the back episodes. God bless you. Wow. I wouldn't wish that torture on anybody. Did you decide...
Especially episode 5.
Yeah. Did you decide on a name for your listeners? I have to agree with Paul Mattingly that Therapals is perfect. Yes, we are leaning in that direction. I've been trying to advocate for theropods, Nick, because the dinosaur thing is cool. But
yeah.
Therapal's catching on, so I don't know. Now for the backstory. I've been in therapy off and on for the last 12 years. I have depression and generalized anxiety disorder due to a childhood sexual abuse, parental rejection, low self-esteem, and weight issues. Therapy, along with the antidepressant and anti-anxiety medications, have been wonderful and gave me tools to work through panic attacks and intrusive thoughts. I recently went through a few weeks of feeling really low and knew I should go back to therapy. The problem is I have new insurance since my last therapy session, and I can no longer go see the same therapist. I tried setting up an appointment with the new therapist, but I can't get in for weeks due to their schedule. My question is, what are your thoughts about online therapy services? I'm considering going this route due to the convenience. I just need to talk things out and get some advice and guidance on some new stress that has occurred in my life. Thanks for the help.
My take on that is any access to therapy is going to be good.
Yes.
Just as a bottom line,
yes.
That first things first, accessing it, that's any access to it is going to be good. So, I don't have any issues with it. I think one of the challenges, probably more for the therapist than for the patient or client, is you do lose a little bit of the connection when you're not physically in the same room.
Sure.
But other than that, I don't see it as being a problem.
Yeah, and I would actually argue this. So I've done both. Okay, as a therapist, I've done face-to-face. I've done over the phone where I can't see them. I've done Skype where I actually can see them and I'm working on it. So I've done all of that, right? What I can tell you is this. There's sometimes it's different. I wouldn't say one's better than the other. When I'm talking to somebody on the phone and I can't see them, there's actually an advantage to that, Nick. And I remember once I came in your office and told you what my patient had told me, which was he said he found himself being much more honest. Because whenever he saw me face to face, he saw me staring at him, right? And there was a desire to sort of perform. But when he was talking to me over the phone, he felt like he could just tell his truth and he can't see my reaction. So it forced him to just sort of be honest about what was going on. And I've also done Skype and, versions of that work in the therapy world where I can like see the other person and I'm talking to them. But I would say, honestly, I echo Nick's point. There is no wrong door to getting help, okay? There's a lot of people hesitate. That's the wrong answer. Hesitating or failing to go forward because you're worried you're going to do the wrong thing is exactly the wrong thing to do. Step forward into help. And, a couple of folks that I would reference to you, betterhelp.com, very, very good website, talkspace.com. Both of those are reputable. They contract with real licensed therapists. They will only link you to a therapist in your area. Therapists aren't really allowed to practice over state lines.
That was going to be my question.
Yeah, and so BetterHelp and Talkspace are really reputable because they intentionally only contract with therapists in your area. And it's a therapist just like me who's seeing clients in person too, but then I might book a few on Talkspace. And so if there was a reason why you needed to come see me face to face, I do exist. I'm in your community. I have a real office. So Talkspace.com, BetterHelp.com. Online therapy, guys, is the future. I think that that's going to be the way that more people access care. And whatever you're going through, whether it's significant or it feels a little mild, seeing a therapist is the right thing. Nick, in this writer's case, she says, I'm not necessarily having too much problems here, but I'm going through some life stress, some things I want to talk about. That's totally appropriate to talk to an online therapist about.
Yeah, and we're really getting to this point in our society where there's no more excuses for not being in therapy.
Right.
I mean, it is becoming a lot more convenient. It's now being covered by insurance. So yeah, any access you have to it, take it.
I agree. So check out BetterHelp.com. Check out Talkspace.com. There's a lot of other good providers out there, but those are two that are extremely reputable, and they tend to contract with licensed therapists in your state. Don't hesitate. Okay, get out there, do it now, go forward. Internet therapy is the future, guys. There's no reason to put it off. Online therapy, talk therapy, doing it over the phone. I've even seen texting therapy, which is a little bit interesting. I think that's a different dynamic, but for some people that really could be a good fit because they could think about what they want to write. So that could be good too, but at the end of the day, Nick's point, anything is better than nothing. So definitely get started today.
Absolutely.
We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we talk about paranoid delusions. You're listening to Pod Therapy.
We're back. You're listening to Pod Therapy. This next question is from a woman whose friend is delusionally paranoid. Hi, guys. I'm a 22-year-old woman who has recently finished university, and lately I have been concerned about a close friend of mine, the same age, who I've known since childhood. Last semester, she dropped out of uni and moved back in with her parents. When I asked her about this, she simply stated that she wasn't feeling well and didn't seem to want to elaborate further. I continued to meet up with her once or twice a month, and aside from vaguely alluding to some bullying incidents that happened at uni, she seemed fine and quite positive about the future. The last time I saw her was 2 weeks ago when a group of us went to a bar and she was quiet and zoned out. When I asked if she is okay, she said she has a headache and hadn't been sleeping well. I didn't think more of it until yesterday on Facebook when I saw she had posted a very long status. In it, she claimed, among other things, that her bullies have broadcasted information about her on TV throughout Asia, we live in Europe, and that her neighbor is trying to frame her for child molestation, that the government has been doing experiments on her while she sleeps and spying on her, and that everywhere she goes, people call her ugly, a slut, and a child molester. Reading all about her delusions and possible hallucinations obviously shocked and scared me a great deal. I managed to find contact details for her dad and called him. He asked me to send him what she had posted, which I did. I was surprised today to get a message from her asking to see me next week, as I had assumed she would be hospitalized, but I agreed to meet with her. Now I'm very uncertain how to behave and how to act in her presence. I also don't know if I should contact our other friends and tell them about the delusions for safety reasons, or if this would be an invasion of privacy, although she did post them on a public forum. I also don't know if I should discuss the delusions with her or how to act if she brings them up. Thank you. Gosh.
So that does sound pretty clearly. I mean, we use the word paranoia. This is probably a good moment here to talk about what is, a delusion, right? Because she says delusions, maybe hallucinations. But yeah, so a delusion is an untrue interpretation of your reality. So when this person is described as believing that people are talking about you, believing that you're being called a child molester on the internet or in Asian media, sensing that people are against you, believing that the government is spying on you. That's not a hallucination in that you're seeing or hearing something that isn't actually there. It's a delusion in that your perception of reality is wrong. That's not a likely explanation of what you're experiencing. But Nick, she also talks about hallucinations. She talks about specifically hearing people's voices as she's walking down the street, calling her a child molester, calling her ugly, calling her a slut. We've seen this kind of thing before, and we've seen people that have paranoid delusions, paranoid hallucinations. We've also seen people that might have diagnosed schizophrenia, which we've talked about on the show before. Mm-hmm. These tend to be symptoms of schizophrenia, though they don't necessarily live inside of schizophrenia. But this is the kind of thing that somebody's usually medicated for, and they usually end up receiving some antipsychotics.
Yeah, there's treatments for it, and it can be very scary, because in this individual's mind, everything, all their behaviors make sense. It's all a response to what they are perceiving as their reality. But when you're outside of that, looking at it, it's kind of scary. And you're like, what's going on? Because I think part of the fear is the unpredictable nature of it. Right. When we're in a situation where we can't predict an outcome, that's anxiety. Right. Actually, I had a neighbor recently that lived kind of down the street from me, and he was obviously having some kind of delusions and hallucinations. He'd be out in the street, with his shirt off, just yelling at people who weren't there. Right. And even I, as a therapist, was kind of like, "Oh shit,
yeah,
I should lock the door." Like I'm kind of afraid.
Right.
But to your question, how should you deal with this? What should you bring it up? Should you not say anything? I would say first and foremost, just be a friend. Yeah. Be supportive. Meet with her, listen to what she has to say. I would say you can challenge a lot of those. I think that could be good. And obviously she has a relationship with you. She wants to meet with you. If she brings it up, then she obviously trusts what you have to say. You could be an ally and you could really help her kind of sort some of this stuff out. Mm-hmm. So that's where I would start. First and foremost, just be supportive.
Don't be afraid.
Don't be afraid. You're not going to break her.
Yeah. That's another thing. A lot of people misperceive.
Right. You're not going to make things worse. You're not going to be able, you're not going to go in there and say, "Oh man, I said this and then it got crazy."
Right. Or I put an idea in their head. There's plenty of ideas in their head. You are not responsible for any of them. I like what she did, Nick, where she alerted the dad and said, "Hey, I'm seeing this on social media. I just wanted to send it your way." That's very smart. I think letting the family know is very important. She may discuss that with you. Whenever you guys meet, she may say, "Hey, my dad said that you sent him this. Here's what's going on," or "Here's what I was saying," or whatever. And that's okay. Don't be afraid. That's not likely to turn into conflict so much. But, another thing that she had said was, "I'm surprised this person called me because I thought they would be hospitalized." So Nick and I have both had to do this. All therapists at some point in their career have to do this. Just in recent history, I had to do this, where I was called to somebody's house and I could, meet the person. And the person that I met was in this kind of state. They were paranoid. They believed that they were being spied on. They were very afraid that others were going to harm them. Now, they had de-escalated, or I should rather say regressed. They regressed to the place where they were incapable of taking care of themselves, and they were considering hurting other people that they believed were plotting against them, and they were sort of living in the desert and just burning in the 110-degree sun and not eating, not sleeping. It had gotten really bad. When that kind of thing happens, a therapist might evaluate that person and might put them on what's generally referred to as a legal hold. And that's whenever we call the police, we call an ambulance, we sign paperwork that sends them to a hospital to be evaluated. Now, in your friend's case, it doesn't quite sound like she's at that place where she lacks the ability to care for herself or she represents a danger to others. And so because we don't have that yet, it'd be unlikely that somebody's going to force her into hospitalization. But conversations that you're having with her, that your dad is having with her, might further reveal the need to get into a therapist or go see a doctor. Mm-hmm. And if she's lucky enough to have that experience, they're probably going to prescribe her some antipsychotic medicine and see if that takes away some of these delusions.
Yeah, and I don't know what the laws are in Europe.
Yeah.
But that it is a frustrating part of what we do in dealing with this is getting someone help if they don't want it. Because ultimately, regardless of what delusions they're having, if they are not a harm to themselves or someone else, it is not a harm to anybody to be posting crazy stuff on Facebook.
Right.
Or to be in your backyard screaming at people who aren't there.
Right.
Or just bizarre behaviors. None of that
Yeah.
is a threat to a person.
Yeah.
So in that case, I mean, even if they got them into the emergency room on a psych hold,
Right.
what are they going to do? They're going
Right.
to meet with them. They're going to hold them until they no longer display those symptoms, or until, let me rephrase that, not until they no longer display the symptoms, until they're no longer a threat.
Yeah, that's it. It's a very
And that's
small
it.
criteria. It's very baseline. And you're right. Like, and the doctors can't just put medicine in them without their consent.
Right.
That's not an option. And this person's from Europe, Nick, but if spouting paranoid nonsense online was something that we could do anything about, there'd be entire television networks in America that would have everybody hospitalized at this point.
Half of my extended family would be in an institution.
Yeah. Half of the Twitter universe would at some point have been evaluated by now. So it only comes down to personal care and harm to others. Whenever a sense of health is in danger, then we can do something about it. But I encourage you, as Nick said, encounter her, talk to her, learn, ask questions, be curious, don't be scared, and then don't be afraid to open up communication with family members. You don't have any kind of confidentiality commitment to her. You're not a healthcare professional. So, it's okay to, if you see something, say something.
Yeah, and first and foremost, come from a place of love and support.
Yes, don't be fearful. But great question.
Yeah, great
and
question.
Please feel free to update us. Let us know how that encounter went. If that's another question for the show, great. If it's just an update to let us know how things are turning out, we'd love to hear more about it.
Yeah. Thank you for writing in.
We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we hear from a man destigmatizing pedophilia. You're listening to Pod Therapy.
We're back. You're listening to Pod Therapy, and this next question is from a man who wants pedophiles to get therapy.
Okay, this person writes in, am I making a mistake by destigmatizing pedophilia? I'll try to keep this short. I know this probably isn't something you'll want to address on air.
Wrong.
Wrong! We'll show you.
You have no idea what we will address on here.
You have no idea how low we will go. Okay, but I could use an outside opinion to know if what I'm suggesting is harmful, so that, if so, I can fix it. I recently wrote an article about something that has a lot of my friends and me very upset, the push to normalize pedophilia. I decided to take as cold and rational a look at the problem as possible. I suggested that the best course of action is to not normalize the disorder, but instead to destigmatize and encourage actively getting help for it. Some of my friends are accusing me of being a pedophile apologist, of defending and legitimizing people who want to hurt kids. I suffer from depression and anxiety, and I know what the stigmatization of treatment does to me. I can only imagine that it's much worse for pedophiles. Thus, I think destigmatizing treatment, but not the act, is the best way to protect kids. I have a moderate following, and I'm responsible for what I say, so I need an outside opinion. Am I making a huge mistake in advocating for this? Am I putting kids in danger?
Wow.
Yeah, so off the bat, I appreciate the honesty.
Absolutely. And this is a really good question because there's kind of this immediate reaction that you get.
Yeah.
Because of what we're talking about, because of the subject matter, right? But then underneath of that, there's a legitimate point in that. But man, that's a really tough line to kind of navigate.
Is.
It kind of reminds me of where addiction was 20 or 30 years ago. Right. When it's seen as, because let me clarify how I understand this before I go into it.
Right.
What I understand our listener is saying is that not to normalize the behavior.
Right.
Not to make an excuse for the behavior, not to condone the behavior, but remove some of the stigma in order to get the person help. So that's the main goal, getting the person help. Not saying, hey, we should legalize this and make it okay.
Right.
This obviously hurts children.
And actually, that's where I want to kind of jump in. So in the Diagnosis and Statistic Manual, 5th edition, the DSM-5, the Psychology Bible, it gives us a list of what we call paraphilic disorders, and these have to do with sexual interest. So one of them might be voyeurism, which is the desire to peeping Tom other people, right? Frauderism, which is the desire to rub up against an unsuspecting civilian on the bus or something like that. So the reason that the DSM wants to classify these as disorders is because most of them cause harm. So whenever there's no harm and it's just in your head, there's no necessarily disorder because you're not acting that out, right? We can't observe a behavior. Now, if it's causing you a clinically significant amount of distress, then it is a problem and you should get a therapist to talk to you about it, right?
Right.
Now, pedophilia is basically the sexual fascination with people who are classified as children, who are under the age of 18. Now, some people have brought up the interesting evolutionary dynamic of this, because until we had societies to arbitrarily designate 18 as the age, it wasn't necessarily so. In the state of Nevada, the age of sexual consent is 16, and that befuddles a lot of the other 49 states because I think we're the youngest one. So what that means is in Nevada, a 30-year-old could have sex with a 16-year-old, and that'd be completely legal. They would not be classified as a pedophile. But if you did that exact same thing in Arizona, you are legally a sex offender, and that's pedophilia, and you'll be forced into sexual assault treatment, right? You'll be a sex offender. So what this person's writing about when they're saying, hey, I want people who know that this is not good for them, that they feel and think these things, but that is illegal and it could potentially cause harm and they could partake of illegal paraphernalia or material. I want them to know it's okay to get help. Because if we just call them a monster and we just slander them and we just scare them, they're never going to tell anybody because they're scared that if I tell a therapist I fantasize about this, he's going to call the police and I'm going to go on a sex registry. So I think about it, Nick, as the Jared from Subway thing. Jared from Subway was this very popular mascot. He was sort of this all-American guy. We all liked his story. And then it became evident that he had an addiction to child pornography, and he was classified as a pedophile. The FBI watched him for 5 years. They locked him away in a federal prison. That's the end of his life and career. If a Jared from Subway could have read something that encouraged him to get help, I would have wanted to see Jared get help instead of go to prison, because I don't want to see more people get hurt. The earlier that we intervene, the better able we are to protect society and protect that person from acting out on unhealthy behaviors. And to me, Nick, this is not much different than what we opened with about the FBI shooter situation. If there's a person who's thinking about committing violence, I would like them to get therapy and not be scared we're going to lock them away.
Right. And there's going to be some people who will listen to this and their immediate reaction to it is going to be, well, therapy's not going to change anything. These people are not going to change. But then I would refer back to an episode that we did a while back when we had our guest Whitney Lewis on here, who works with juvenile sex offenders. And actually, their research doesn't support that idea. The research actually would indicate that treatment does work. The earlier the intervention, the better. So kind of going back to the point that I was making earlier, I feel like we were kind of in this space when, several years ago with drug and alcohol addiction, when we were looking at it as being a flaw in personality or a flaw in the individual's morals, or this is a problem within that person.
Right.
To looking at when we switched and kind of looked at where does the data take us? What does the research indicate? And that indicates that there's more to this. There's a biological component. This fits within the disease concept.
Yeah.
Once we get to that point, then now people are more willing to actually get help. Yeah. And they're more willing to go to treatment and do these programs. But the uninformed who look at this, from their perspective, it's going to look like, well, you're just making excuses for their behavior. I deal with that all the time.
Right.
With parents or family members, people who don't buy into the disease concept of addiction. They're just like, well, you're just telling them that they're not responsible for their own choices, and that, but that's not at all what we're doing. Right? It's a big misconception, and we have to address that because it keeps people from getting help.
And the war on drugs was unsuccessful. When you just criminalize and you don't attempt to change the human or address why the human does these things, you're just not going to get results. And so to the writer's question of, is it good for people that identify as having pedophilic desires to get help? Yes. Is that better than just threatening them with handcuffs? Oh, yeah, that's probably way better, and it will be more successful for society. Now, the deeper question here, I kind of consulted with Dr. Victoria Hartman about this one.
You did?
A little. I didn't.
Okay.
I didn't pick her mind too much, but I kind of let her know we were going to talk about this, and she said, "Well, she's going to listen to the episode." So, hi, Victoria. She said, "I'm going to listen to see what you guys said." I realize there's a deeper debate that can be had about what is consent, and is it a good idea for America especially, who struggles with sexuality and normalizing sexuality, to start becoming the referee of what kind of sexual desire is acceptable and not acceptable. Most of us will agree that sexually desiring a child falls into a special category of that child's incapable of understanding consent to this. They don't have an adult brain. And so they're sort of off limits. They're a specially protected demographic of humans who you're not allowed to target for sexual desire. And because we don't want to see them exploited in pornography or put in bad situations or trafficked, we also outlaw any kind of pornographic material that might represent that. So that too will be a crime. So, that deeper debate is, I think, left for scholars and people that want to have it. We're therapists. We deal with people who walk into our office and say, here's a problem in my life that's going to cause harm. Help me deal with it. And to that extent, I agree with the writer. I think that you telling people, hey, if you've had these thoughts, get help, that kind of destigmatizing is the right kind of destigmatizing. If you're a listener to our show and you've had these kinds of thoughts, I want you to know it's okay to get help. It's okay to come talk to a therapist. We're not going to slap cuffs on you. We're going to talk about what's going on.
Right. We have laws with confidentiality. Like
That's right.
That's the whole reason why therapy can be effective, is because you have a place where you can go there, you can talk about stuff that isn't going to get out, and you can be 100% honest. So if that's what he's referring to as far as destigmatizing in order to drive the person in to get help, absolutely.
Yes.
All for that.
And it was interesting because obviously this is a very powerful word, pedophilia. And Dr. Hartman had pointed out, she said, Jim, on your show I talked about necrophilia.
Yeah, I was actually going to bring that up.
Yeah, and she was telling me, pedophilia is actually an order of magnitude more confrontational and controversial than necrophilia, having sex with dead people. It's like, gosh, she's right. That's it really has a special place in the American consciousness. So, if you're out there and you've had these thoughts, or you know anybody that does, it's important to realize the person's not just inherently this broken monster any more than a person who's drug addicted, who's stolen from you and committed crime is inherently this monster, this immoral beast. They're a person who's struggling with unhealthy psychology that's causing them to act in certain ways that are not something that our society allows or permits. If that's the case, that causes a clinically significant amount of distress in that person's life. Refer them to helpers immediately. Get help. Don't continue to act out.
So, Dr. Hartman, if any of this information that Jim is sharing is inaccurate, I guess that just means you have to come back on the show and set the record straight.
Gauntlet thrown. She's like right down the road.
I know.
We can look out the studio window and wave at her. So
we should have her back anyway.
We should have her back. So thank you so much for writing that question. I would say that you are helping children by encouraging people who have these desires to get help, that you are not an apologist for pedophilia. So that would be my answer to you. And if you're out there and you're having these thoughts, get help immediately. Do not commit a crime. All right, that's all the time that we've got for this week's session. Thank you to those who contributed to our show today. We really appreciate it. Remember, pod therapy isn't something you should keep all to yourself. Help us reach others by sharing this episode. You can find us at facebook.com/podtherapy or on Twitter @PodTherapyGuys.
Do you want to add your own advice to today's questions? Post your thoughts at podtherapy.net and join the conversation. I'm Nick Tangeman.
I'm Jim Jobin.
Thanks, and we'll see you at Scoop Fest.
Yeah, in October.
All right, we'll see you then.
Or your appointment next week.
That too.